I think it's really appropriate that on International Women's Day, we're having a session on women on the front line, because I think it can't be underestimated the amount that the miners' strike fed in and changed and affected the role of women, both in the mining communities and vice versa, how women had an enormous and an essential part in keeping the strike strong, and the way they supported the miners but also took action on their own to keep the strike going for that year. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brigette Bell from North Staff's Miners' Wives Action Group to speak for 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I have to tell you that over the last 6 months, at National Women Against Pit Closures level, because I'm now living in Barnsley and I'm very involved with the national organisation, we've had so many requests from meetings that have been going on with a view to this 30th anniversary, that women have really been stretched in terms of attending all the meetings. And we've got events going on all throughout the South Yorkshire, the Wales, and Notts, and coalfields in Scotland. So it is an absolute tribute to the organisation that came about during that dispute, that still 30 years on, when some of the women, our women members, you know, they were in their 50s, in the 80s. So, you know, when Anne and Betty go off and they're in their 70s to do sessions today, you can see that struggle is good for you. It keeps you healthy, you know, keeps you on your feet. And I have to say, I was pleased to come down with Rose to London, because I'm proud, not only on behalf of North Staff's Miners' Wives Action Group, but on behalf of National Women Against Pit Closures, to pay tribute to London, to all the supporters in London, because you were the epicentre of all the miners' support groups. And there's a very important role that the miners' support groups played, and that the miners' support groups are, in a sense, as important and vital as Women Against Pit Closures was during that strike. And in that sense, today is a celebration of the solidarity and the networks that we created in such a short space of time. Can you remember? It was such a short space of time. I mean, we all knew that the Tory government had been planning since the late 60s, from the Ridley report onwards, to put the boot in on the National Union of Mine Workers. It's the organisation, the most militant organisation of the trade union movement. They'd been planning that long. And I think they thought it was going to be a much easier crush than it turned out to be. Support groups and women's organisation at every pit level was up and running within a matter of weeks. And as a result of those tremendous organisations that grew from the base, National Women Against Pit Closures didn't start National Women Against Pit Closures. It was women in every pit village, alongside the miner support groups. I came through Stoke Miner Support Group. My political activity before the strike came along, I was involved with the Women's Aid movement, so I was involved with women's refugees. I was involved with miners' wives who were in the struggle for women's refugees with me, so I already had an involvement with a very active political mining community of women. We mustn't assume that all the miners' wives were at home at the kitchen sink. They weren't. There were lots of miners. There was a tradition of militancy within the mining community that included the women. They were in trade unions. They were active in the Women's Aid movement. And when that strike came along, we already had those networks on the ground. What we were able to do through the miner support groups and then through the women's support groups was to make effective what was necessary in order to sustain that struggle. And I don't need to tell you, the women and the miner support groups were vital to the sustaining of that struggle. When the men came out on strike, they came out with a sense through those gates of their collective strength, because their industrial militancy was something they'd grown up with. Women in the mining communities might have had a sense of their collective strength within their communities, but they didn't understand the possibilities for their collective strength till they entered those food kitchens and those food centres. And let me tell you this, the food centres were vital to the very fabric of that strike, the very interweaving of everybody within the community was based on what went on in those food centres. The food centres weren't about a domestic role. It wasn't about women making sandwiches and cooking. Actually, Rose, that you heard earlier, she never cooks. When I go round her house, I have to do the cooking. And Brenda, our chair of National Women, can't get her to make a sandwich on principle. I'm always the one doing the cooking. The food centres were much more than that. The food centres were at the heart of the communities, and what they were was providing physical sustenance for the community, but in a collective way, not in a privatised way. And so women got involved with organising where the food came from. Inevitably, they had to go out and they had to raise the money. So minor support groups from London were saying to the women at the food, send someone down to speak. The women became the front line of that struggle because they were the speakers who really moved communities of people outside of the mining community to understand and relate to that struggle. And it was the impetus from the food centres that did that. The organisation that went into the food centre still amazes me. I live in Worsborough now, and Anne and the women that organised the kitchen down at Worsborough, they did 400 meals 4 times a week. I was just, when they told me, I thought, if we did the statistics and added up all the pit canteens across the 180,000 miners and their families that were on strike, how many meals? What a provision was that? Now, look, this is a provision without any planning. They didn't sit in a committee for 6 months planning it. It was done within a matter of weeks. And that's what's so exciting about the possibilities in class struggle. What we discover about our power and our abilities. And that was enhanced by the existence of minor support groups. There's no doubt about it. Every action by a minor support group down here strengthened the women's support groups in the pit villages and vice versa. And that symbiosis meant that that strike was not only able to become the inspiration that it is today, but it also set wheels in motion for those who were involved with the strike to continue the struggle when the strike was called off. And so that's why today, 30 years on, the North Staffs Miners' Wives Action Group still is active. The Women Against Pit Closures, which was always, in fact, came out of all those different groups. It was always a federation of different women's miners' wives groups, comes together when it's necessary to mobilise at a national level. So look how the experience of that struggle made women so determined to carry on that by the time we got to 92, 93, the next round of pit closures, the women were in the forefront of the initiatives to fight those pit closures. And what we did then, by setting up pit camps and by occupying the pits, in a sense, was an expression of all the ideas that we'd gathered along the way from 84, 85 through involvements with support groups and the movement generally. The time spent at Memworth Hill and Greenham Common, the time spent with women on the picket line and especially from the Asian community, the Asian women workers who stood at Burnsall on the picket line, Malky at Bilko later on, who stood there at Hillingdon Hospital. Those experiences of mixing with courageous trade unionists, an example to us all. The Women Against Pit Closures groups were open to those ideas. They were open to those ideas because it was a fertile time. And struggle is a fertile time. I'd almost say that the Women Against Pit Closures members, in a sense, made links with other groups, both nationally and internationally, because in a way, as a movement, we were more open to ideas. You know, the trade, you know, the miners, of course, were at the heart of this struggle. They withdrew their labour, they went on strike. But those connections, those links that were made with all support groups, were in fact a product of an openness, a growth that came from the women having left their kitchens and entered into collective action and experienced collective strength. Trade union bureaucracy wasn't an issue. You know, we weren't going to be fettered by meetings and votes and things like that. We did direct action, and you know, and in a sense, there will always be the need to resist the trade union bureaucratic fetters on our class struggle. And women, in a sense, were important, along with their connections with the minor support groups, for driving forward all sorts of imaginative actions and learning from other struggles that were going on in that time. I mean, Rose has already said it. We went to Wapping, we went to Ireland, we went to support the seafarers. We even went to a little church in Manchester, Rusholme it was called, and there was a guy in there, a Tamil, called Viraj Mendis. And we used to go up from Stoke and take some food up, and we'd sing some songs, because Fran has taught us how to sing, so we used to take our songs to sing to him. And he'd be sitting there. I think he was absolutely in a state of shock every time we arrived, you know. Like, who are they? Why do they keep coming in and singing to me, you know? But we were proud to be in a small little place like that, supporting a political refugee, as much as we were to be engaged at Wapping, facing another torrent of state violence from the police. Where we went from there was into the second round of pit closures, and in the course of employing what we'd learned during that struggle and afterwards, we set up pit camps and we occupied the pits. And in doing that, we further strengthened not only our resolve and belief in our own power collectively, but we extended the struggle. We made it more imaginative. Those pit camps became a focus for the community. I mean, I could spend hours telling you all the things that happened in those pit camps. The knocks on the door at 7 a.m, and you open the door, you know, because we had late nights at the caravan. And we had a lot of drinking, you know, at the night. And you'd open the door, and there'd be a local, you know, somebody just come up the road with the paper and a bottle of milk for us, for our breakfast, you know. I mean, it was fantastic. I think the most disturbing experience we had in that caravan was when we were eating our stew, which I'd made again, I'm the cook. And we thought we heard a mumbling going on outside. And we didn't know whether we were beginning to be affected by our presence in this little tin box, you know, whether we were starting to hallucinate. And Brenda said, "Go on, Bridge, open the door." I said, "I don't know. Do you think it might be a goat?" She said, "Open the door." And I opened the door, and you never guess who it was. It was the Bishop of Stafford, and he was blessing our caravan. I couldn't believe it. You can't keep the church out of anything, can you? Sod off. But anyway, you know, we wouldn't refuse the support of God. Of course we wouldn't, you know. But it was, you know, it was a focus for the community. And you see, when it comes to class struggle, we've got the possibilities for creating spaces where we can meet and take control and share in our power. And I think the women never found that difficult. They never felt hampered by traditions of trade union activity. And that's why it was so exciting to be involved with such an outstanding and vibrant working class movement of women. And why today we still have those networks, and we still feel absolutely compelled to share in that amazing struggle. And we know it is an inspiration to others who are engaged in struggle. We know it will continue to be an inspiration in future. But we don't doubt that the inspiration we gained from seeing the struggles of others, and again I pay tribute to the contribution that Asian women workers have made to the trade union struggles that they've engaged in, and we still maintain our, our contacts with Melchior and the Burnsall strikers to this day. No, today is a celebration about our power. We can be optimistic when you've been through a class struggle like the miners' strike and you continue 30 years down the line and you're still there struggling. You can be not only proud of that achievement, but you can be optimistic today, comrades and sisters, because I tell you what, if we can organise like we did in a matter of weeks and months, and those buggers are sitting down planning it, aren't they, for years, then we have everything to gain from our power, our collective power. For us, this celebration is about the weapon of the strike. The strike is still the weapon of the working class. There's no question about that. I can speak on behalf of all the Women Against Pit Closures members that I have contact with, and we don't think Parliament is a source of power. Fuck Parliament. Our power is in a weapon of the strike. It's the only weapon we've got as organised working class. But in itself, it, as a weapon, can be part of a much wider class struggle, and it will do, by necessity. But that strike has got to become a strike that is used throughout the whole of the trade union movement. And as long as we've got a TUC leadership which is like a bloody noose round our necks, and as long as we've got too many trade union leaders creeping up the arse of the Labour Party, we are not going to be in a position to use that weapon effectively. So the strike is about not being pessimistic. We have got a weapon there. It's a weapon to take action collectively and use our industrial power. But we are not the problem in terms of using that effectively. We can use it as long as we're not hampered by the fetters of a traditional trade union and Labour Party that constantly put nooses round our necks. I pay tribute today to you, supporters in London. You can't imagine how people sit in pit villages all around South Yorkshire, and they did in Stoke when I was up there, and talk about the supporters from London. I tell you, if you think you've been forgotten, I tell you haven't. And it is my privilege today to come here and pay tribute to you, the minor support groups of London. Thank you very much.
Hi, and next up we've got Joyce Sheppard, not from Bentley Support Group, from Thorn Miners' Wives Action Group. And she's going to speak for 10 minutes. Then I forgot to introduce everyone else. And Lindsey German's going to speak for 10 minutes. And then we're going to open up the floor for contributions and questions. So, Joyce.
Right, thank you. Just pull my trousers out.
Oh, I'd just like to say Joyce is also a contributor to our film and was on Woman's Hour yesterday, as far as
Can you hear me? I'm not used to using these microphones. Is that better? Oh, yeah. Talking about the interview I did yesterday for the BBC, which was quite strange, but they rang me, and the woman that I spoke to, who I thought was a researcher but turned out to be the producer, the first question she asked me was a very strange one, but it made me think about it. And she said, "Do you think that women against pit closures have been sentimentalised?" And I thought, well, what do I say to that? And then I thought, blimey, it wasn't sentimental at all. If you were part of it, there was no, sentimental didn't come into it. But it's a danger, I think, that the media are quite patronising sometimes, especially towards, working class women who get involved in things like that. I mean, when I did the programme yesterday, I was listening in before I had to speak, and I had to listen to 3 elderly women who were the oldest peers in the House of Lords, and their voices were so posh I could hardly hear them. And I thought, crikey, it's going to be me and my South Yorkshire accent on in a minute. I mean, how do you follow that? And anyway, I thought, in for a penny, in for a pound. But that's besides the point. Just a little pot of history. In 1984, I was 34 years old. I was married to a miner, and he worked at Askham Pit, which is 10 miles the other side of Doncaster. I had 2 children. We didn't have a lot of money. We had a normal working class life. You know, I worked as a school cleaner across the road in what was then the middle school. We didn't ask for a lot. We used to go to on a holiday for a week to Brigette or Scarborough. You know, we had very kind of normal. We wanted the best. We wanted a little bit more for our children, and then the strike came. But it's like I said yesterday, the strike didn't start in isolation. I mean, there was fear already within working class communities. I mean, my husband had already worked at the steelworks, and they'd already come for the steelworks. He then moved and went to work at the pits, and now we were faced with unemployment. And there was a lot of fear that rippled through these villages. But then that turned to anger, and that overrode the fear. When the strike started, the women got. I lived in a pit house in a predominantly mining community, and most of the people that were my neighbours. The men worked at the pits. But because Thorn didn't have a pit of its own that was working, it was mothballed. They all had to. They were like pit, you know. They were sent all over Doncaster area. But we were all mining families. And when the strike started, the women got together, and we met in a pub. And they said, you know, do you think we ought to get together and try and have a group to open a soup kitchen? Which is what we did. We went out on the streets collecting money into places I'd never been before. We went into York. I'd never been to York. I only lived so many miles away, and I'd never been. And there we were down the Shambles in York with a miner's newspaper over our arms and rattling the buckets. So out of place in a place like York. And we got, you know, the Americans coming up to us and the Japanese wanting to know what was happening, putting money in. So we got moved on by the police, and they said, you know, if we didn't move, they would arrest us. And I thought, well, I'm not leaving York until I've been in the Minster and had a look round. I might never see it again. So I went round the York Minster with my miners' newspapers on my arm. And then we all piled into the minibus and went back home in a van that broke down halfway there, and we had to freewheel. I do remember that. But we did all sorts of things like that. The only problem was there was a lot of women there who didn't want to just make the mash and the stew and whatever. Not that there was anything wrong in that, but you realised the way the strike was going, it was going to take more. And a lot of women wanted to do more. And that's when we started to organise pickets. And we picketed in Nottingham. I can remember going on a night picket, and it was all women. And we got through to Nottingham quite easily, whereas the men couldn't get through during the day. I mean, I don't know how many people in the country at the time realised that there was it had to be unlawful. They were stopping people from going from one county to another and sending men back. Maybe people who weren't even involved, but if you came from South Yorkshire and you was a man and you was in a car, back you went, mate. You weren't going to get into Nottingham. But women, you know, little women, you know, we were in our car, trundled through to a pit called Calverton Colliery. And it was the first picket I'd ever been on. And it was the biggest shock of my life. I mean, when we got there, there was about 20 or 30 women right at the pit gates. And suddenly all these cops appeared from out the pit club. And they surrounded us. And they were breathing alcoholic, beery breaths down his neck, talking about how much overtime money they'd got and where they were going for the holidays. Not that that made any difference, you know, I'll go away. Then more and more women came, and there must have been 200 women there. And it was the first time I'd ever encountered kettling. I didn't even know, there wasn't even a word for it then. And we all ended up on this piece of grass being kept there prisoner by then. There were more police sent for. And I remember getting claustrophobia and panicking and getting out of this group and across the road. And this very senior policeman with a big baton came over and he said, if you don't get back in there with the other women, I'm going to arrest you. So I did. Anyway, long story short, two of my friends were arrested in that. In fact, there were 12 women arrested, and I can remember seeing an elderly woman, and she actually fainted and fell through the police cordon, and two of them just dragged her away across the yard, the pit yard, and all her knees were grazed, and she was getting on. She was an elderly woman. All these women ended up at court. Yvonne, my friend, she was arrested and taken to the local police station along with the other women. And they were grilled by these police saying, did Arthur send you here tonight? Did Arthur send... I mean, oh yeah, he rang us up each individually and said, would you go to Calverton Colliery? I mean, Arthur Scargill was as distant to us as anything, and it's like what's been said before. It was a figurehead, but a lot of what was done on our own imagination, our own, we wanted to do this. We weren't told what to do. We wanted to do it. And some other terrible things happened to these women. I mean, they were forced to use a toilet with no door on, so that people, they were seen by everybody that was walking wherever, in the police station. And then they ended up going to court, of which I was the witness. And they were all found guilty. I mean, it was a foregone conclusion, and they all got criminal records and whatever, which was tragic. But when you hear about the brutality of the police, I didn't see it as men saw it on their pickets, but I saw it from a woman's point of view. I think I'm going off my track a bit here. I think what was important about that time was the community. I know it's a word that's bandied about a lot, but there was a community, and people lived in a community, and people kind of looked after one another. I mean, it wasn't all roses. I mean, not every, it's like in every community, whether it's working class or whatever, all people aren't nice, but there was a feeling of you all had to be together, and it was a great feeling. It was exciting. Although we were scared, it was an exciting, exhilarating feeling. And it came back last week. There was, I think it's been mentioned, the women who work for Care UK in Doncaster, been out on strike for a week. And we had a big rally, and it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, they talked about the miners' strike, and it was an absolute great feeling, and I thought, it's still there. It's still there. It's that seed that wants watering and nurturing, and people are brave. I mean, men and women are brave, but women are brave. They work in this terrible firm that's going to slash the wages, and they look after the most vulnerable people in society, and they're prepared to do what many other workers haven't done, and I just felt so happy. I thought, cracky, this is how it used to be. Been waiting ages for this. Thatcher's legacy. I mean, I was talking about it earlier. When she died, we all we didn't all celebrate, but we celebrated. And I remember during the strike, the Brighton bombing, and when I heard about it, it was a terrible thing for me to feel, but I wanted her to be dead. I wanted this woman to be dead. And I felt guilty. I felt guilty because I couldn't understand why I wanted another human being. And I don't really know, well, I do know why I hated her. Because this strike wasn't in isolation. I mean, everything that government did was against working class people. It was against your children. I can remember taking away the unemployment benefit from 16-year-olds. Oh, right, thank you. I'm getting carried away. Just one other thing. It's, we were called the enemy within. And that was a great soundbite for her to, label all these striking miners' families. We were the enemy within. But they are the enemy. And they always will be the enemy. And as well I've got, breath in my body, I'll fight them as the enemy, like I did 30 years ago.
Next, I'm introducing Lindsey German, who is the convener of the Stop the War Coalition, and is also going to talk about her experience in the strike and how it relates to the anti-war movement.
Okay, thanks very much, Sinead. And I'd just like, first of all, and this is International Women's Day, and I think there couldn't be a more fitting way of celebrating International Women's Day than to be here and to be discussing the role of women in that strike. And of course it isn't just an isolated example, but it's a very, very important example which I think changed the face of the working class in this country in all sorts of ways. And now it's normally accepted, not that we've had any long strikes like that for a very, very long time, but if you think of the ones that did take place afterwards, they always had a component of women organising. The Wapping strike just down the road of printers, the women on the waterfront in Liverpool, all of the different strikes that took place were ones which people began to say, this has to have a women's element, not just whether the women are on strike, but they have a specific role that they play in it. And that alone, I think, makes the Women Against Pit Closures such an important historical change in terms of how people began to see the working class and began to see a working class with a much, much bigger organised female component in it. So I'd like, first of all, just to pay tribute to that and to the speakers today, and I think her name was Rose in the previous session, for all the things that they've explained and that they've said, because it seems to me that that experience is something that we still live with. And I don't know if people saw on Channel 4 News, there was a little feature about miners in South Wales earlier in the week, and had a number of women in that. They went back and photographed people they photographed 30 years ago. Every single one of those people said it was the best year of my life. Everyone talked about the hardship, the difficulty, the police violence, all the other things that people suffered, and very, very real things that people suffered, and the great difficulties that people had. But everybody said they never regretted doing it, and they would always do it all again. And I think that's such a fantastic, important example of working class organisation, that people feel like that, and that they don't see it as something that was a sacrifice of their lives, but it was something that gave their lives real meaning and some idea of how they could change things. And that's really what I want to talk about this morning, because I think when you look at society as a whole, when you look at how we're divided up, when you look at the way in which we're told that women are inferior to men, that black people are inferior to white people, that there's something strange about people who aren't heterosexual, all the different prejudices that we get, all the scapegoating that we're getting at the moment about trying to divide working class people between those who have benefits and those who go out to work. Not mentioning, of course, that the majority of benefits go to people who are in work and we're subsidising greedy landlords and low-paying employers. That's the truth of the situation. But they try all the time to divide people up. And a lot of the time, they succeed. A lot of the time they succeed because people think, maybe it is that person's fault. Maybe I'm getting low wages because of immigrants. Maybe all these things are the fact. And what you find is, of course, you can argue one-to-one with those ideas and with those people. And it's very, very important that we do at work through constant discussion and argument about all these things. But what is also true is that when you see people moving into struggle, you see these ideas changing in a very, very big way. Not just about one individual suddenly sees the light, but hundreds or thousands or even millions of people suddenly begin to say this is a very, very different way of looking at things. And when you think about the examples that have been given, the people who went to Ireland and found out that actually it wasn't just the way it was portrayed on television, the truth about what was going on in Northern Ireland. That people who met black people who supported the strike and suddenly realised it wasn't just about these divisions between black and white. That lesbians and gays, who played an incredibly important role in terms of supporting the miners' strike, that began to break down some very, very deep-rooted prejudices which existed within the working class movement. And it seems to me that this is one of the most important lessons we need to keep hold of. That it's through people moving into activity, into challenging the system, that they then begin to see a much, much wider picture and a different picture from the one that they've been told all their lives. I showed my students a film of the miners' strike, a BBC film, which not as good as the film that's going to be coming out in June, but actually not a bad film, which shows the year of the miners' strike. The shocking thing for me, who lived through the strike, and obviously they didn't, even now, is to see the police violence and the police presence in the coalfields. Even, you remember it, of course, but in a way you forget it and you don't realise how bad it was. And I asked them, what do they think of it? What do they think of the miners? What do they think of the police? And the most common response that you get is it's like the riots, the riots of 2011. Now that tells me that people begin to make these kind of connections between the different struggles, and that is so important for us. Now, when you look at what is happening in this country today, of course, we've suffered a series of very, very serious setbacks. The miners' strike was a turning point in that sense, a turning point that nobody in the NUM wanted, that none of us who supported the miners wanted, but it was a turning point in terms of people said, if the miners can't win, what chance have the rest of us got? And it's the legacy today is still with us in terms of the weakness of the trade unions, in terms of, perhaps more importantly, the race to the bottom, in terms of our wages and conditions, which Margaret Thatcher started. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, on International Women's Day, I think enough has been very eloquently said about her, but, it surely must make us realise that there is no common sisterhood of women, that there is a class question there as well. And Margaret Thatcher was a fantastic fighter for her class, and and that's why they gave her what was in effect a state funeral when she died last year, and that the Tories were desperate to get people lining the streets, although not very successfully. There were lots of empty spaces as far as I could see, and there's lots of celebrations in the coalfields and elsewhere. But that race to the bottom has had particularly serious consequences for women, but it is also a class attack. We have a government today which has launched the biggest attack on working class people, even than Thatcher did in the 80s. That they are attacking the whole of the welfare state, the whole of our working conditions. We now have a situation where the gender pay gap in this country, i.e. the gap between men's and women's wages, is widening again. And the reason for it is very interesting why it is widening. It narrowed between 2008 and 2011. The reason for that was not because everybody's wages were going up, but that men's wages were falling faster than women's. Since 2011, it's the other way round. Women's wages are being pushed down even faster than men's. But both of us, both men and women inside the working class, are under massive attack. And it seems to me that one of the things we need to talk about is how we begin to organise to fight back. We have a fantastic level of resilience inside the working class movement. You don't get it from the BBC, you don't get it from most of the media, you don't get any of these sorts of things. But actually, if you look at what is happening around the country, there are people opposing the bedroom tax, there are people out on strike in Doncaster, the teachers and the college lecturers have been out on strike, and teachers are coming out on strike again later this month. There are hundreds and hundreds of different campaigns. We have a big campaign in terms of the anti-war movement over the war in Syria last year that was very, very important for us. There are all these different things going on. The crucial thing is we need to link all these struggles together. That is point one. The final point I'll make is this, that International Women's Day was founded in 1910 at a socialist women's conference, international conference in Copenhagen, by women like Clara Zetkin, the German socialist. It was founded in solidarity with a group of women strikers in New York who the previous year had gone on strike, garment workers, mostly teenagers, mostly Jewish immigrants, who went out on strike and who inspired the whole world. And it was something where they said this isn't just about women's rights, it's also about changing the rotten, exploitative class society in which we live. It seems to me in 2014 we need to rededicate ourselves to fighting, not just for better conditions, not just to raise the living standards of everybody, but also for fighting for a different kind of society which doesn't have oppression and the discrimination of women at the heart of it.
Finally, I'd like to introduce Sheila MacGregor. Sheila was really active during the miners' strike and was actually at the Battle of Orgreave, I've heard from witness accounts. And also, Sheila is an active member of the NUT and the East London Teachers Association, which is the area that we're in at the moment. And she's going to talk about the strike and hopefully the upcoming strike amongst the teachers at the moment.
Okay, well, first of all, apologies for being late. I was actually out leafleting for about why we're striking against Gove on March the 26th. So apologies for missing the start of your talk. My role during the miners' strike was actually not to do with women during the miners' strike, because I was actually the industrial organiser for the Socialist Workers' Party at the time. So my key role was actually working with the men, the miners who joined the SWP during the miners' strike, who were in the SWP. And my central role, as part of the overall what the Socialist Workers' Party was about, was how do we win? And really what I want to focus on is why we didn't win. Because, I mean, there's no question about it, that the miners, the mining communities, the women against pit closures, all the people who supported the miners' strike actually put up the fight of their lives. It was a superb fight. It got superb support. The support in this country never dropped below a third, despite the BBC and all the TV channels and the media being day in and out pounding against the miners, actually portraying the miners as the enemy within and, you know, brutality. The miners were just thugs and so on and so forth. Despite that, the international support grew and grew and grew, you know, from miners in South Africa to Australia to the United States, because people understood that this was a class battle, which, if we won it in Britain, would also have repercussions internationally. And we could have won the thing. And what is really important for me is that if you can win a battle, you have to understand why you lost it, because it affects everybody, the entire working class movement. Women are worse off if you lose. Gay and lesbian people are worse off if you lose. Black people are worse off if you lose, because actually defeat means confidence is undermined inside the working class, and that feeds into all sorts of backward ideas inside the movement. So I'm going to focus on how we could have won. Because the other side, if you read, there's two extremely good books. There's Seamus Mills' one, The Enemy Within. There's the Great Strike by Alex Kalinikos and Mike Simons, and then there'll be the film which is coming out. Thatcher and the Tories prepared the strike. They wanted to defeat the miners as the vanguard, as they saw it, of the working class movement in order to teach the rest of us a lesson. So they prepared for it. Leon Britton said the preparations for the miners' strike were like preparing to defeat Hitler. Right? Thatcher, they set up a police force of 20,000 strong, which they could call on nationally in order to occupy the mining villages and to stop movement and to control people just as if it was a war zone. They actually set up scab lorry drivers. They actually marshalled those so they could actually break the solidarity of rail drivers. And they brought in somebody called Ian MacGregor. Actually, my dad's called Ian MacGregor, which was quite embarrassing during the strike. They brought in Ian MacGregor from the United States, who defeated the steel industry in the United States, in order to take on, first of all, he was part of defeating steel in this country in 1980. Then he was actually part of defeating the car workers in Longbridge. He was part of the architect of getting rid of Derek Robinson. And then they put him in charge of the miners. They were out to break the miners, and they actually prepared for it. They had a war cabinet which met twice a week, and so they were on a civil war footing. The problem was our side was not on the civil war footing. Now, the question we have to answer is, why did the miners win in 1972 under Joe Gormley, who was a right-wing leader, right? And why did we lose in 1984-85, when in actual fact Arthur Scargill is, as far as I'm concerned, the finest trade union leader we've had? He's a damn sight better than anything that we've got around today, frankly, because he, day in and day out, he actually stood for the miners and put the case despite the massive pressure which was on him, and he didn't flinch. And actually, there are not many people who are like that around, who actually do not flinch from putting the class argument that this was a class war, out to break the miners, and so on and so forth. However, how come we could win it in 72, 74, and then not win it in 1984, 85? And the transformation inside the working class movement is the reason that we didn't win it then, and it's the problem which still hampers us today. And that is this. In 1972, right across industry, and increasingly across schools, across hospitals, there were rank-and-file shop stewards who were elected by their members, who were confident about either taking strike action or delivering solidarity action inside the workplace, completely independently of what the trade union leadership was saying. So the turning point in 1972 was Saltley Gates. Arthur Scargill was a rank-and-file miner at the time. He organised the picketing. They had flying picketing. They were quite consistent. They went from power station to power station and closed them down. They then went to stockpile after stockpile of coal and closed them down. They landed up in Saltley in the heart of Birmingham with 100,000 engineers. 20,000 miners couldn't close it down. So Scargill goes off to the East Birmingham District Committee of the Engineers and says, do you want to go down in history as the people who sold out the miners, or do you want to go down in history as the people who helped the miners win? I don't want your money. I want your strike action. I want you out striking alongside us, and I want you down at Saltley Gates. 2 days later, the 100,000 engineers, and not just engineers, but other workers in Birmingham, were out on strike and marched to Saltley Depot and closed it down. And that was a turning point inside the strike, because the government was faced with a choice, and they said it at the time. Somebody said, why don't you send in the army to move these pickets away? And the police commissioner said, well, do I send them in with bayonets, with guns loaded or unloaded? Because actually, if you've got 100,000 people out on strike already and you shoot a few, how many hundreds of thousands and millions do you think would have been out on strike the next day for shooting people? Because the level of solidarity was so great. So they backed off. The problem is, when it came to 1984-85, and this is the horrible truth that me and the party members who are inside the pits and the people round about us were up against at the time, is that picketing was not organised by rank-and-file strike committees at the pits. They did not choose where to go and picket. So they could not do the systematic targeting of staying in Nottinghamshire to keep the Notts pits out. They couldn't go systematically from power station to power station to actually close them down. They were controlled because of the purse strings. The officials control the purse strings, and if you're out on strike, you don't have the money to go where you want because you have to have your petrol paid for. So there was not the systematic organisation of picketing that there had been in 1972. There were two other instances, because actually it's in the Cabinet Papers. When the dockers came out on strike in the summer, in July and August, they too could have won. The problem was the Dover docks, scab lorry drivers, went and stormed the docks and said the strike actually had to be stopped in Dover. Well, it's simple, isn't it? If you have a bunch of scabs storming the docks, what do? You get every single miner, every single docker, down to Dover docks, and you keep it closed. And then you go for solidarity action in order to keep it closed. It didn't happen. And because it didn't happen, the strike actually in the docks collapsed, and that let the government off the hook. And that kind of problem where the left union officials inside the trade union movement were pledging money and giving money and pledging support. The right wing of the trade union movement, including Neil Kinnock, leader of the Labour Party at the time, frankly, when somebody produced a poster with a noose hanging over Kinnock's neck, I thought, yes, because actually he damned the miners at the time. He damned the miners. He damned the violence of the miners. He made the miners to blame when actually it was the police forces who were blamed. And so the final thing I want to say is this. As a teacher, when we were out on strike right across the board in 2011 in November, that was a point where we could have taken the whole thing forward and we could have defeated the government over pensions then. If we did have defeated them over pensions then, we'd defeat them over cuts, we'd defeat them over pay. And actually we'd all be in a much, much, much better position than we are today. Who called it off? The right-wing union leaders called it off to start with, but then the left wobbled. The left union leaders wobbled,
and we didn't get any more strike action. And a couple of years later, fortunately, we're getting more strike action, but it's only a day. And the lesson for me is this, is everybody, like everybody who's in this room, everybody wants to have to fight. We actually have to say, we have to organise ourselves to fight, independently of the union officials if they're not prepared to fight. If they are prepared to fight, of course we do it, like we do on March the 26th, you know, when we're going to be out there picketing and out demonstrating against Gove and so on and so forth. We have to get that, you know, when you said Scargill was up there and we did what we wanted, I thought to myself, if only the miners had done exactly the same, because that's a lesson we have to take. The women organised and did what they wanted and did the right thing in terms of the strike. We, all of us inside the trade union movement, we have to do exactly the same, and that's my lesson, really.